Now we have Colin Walker, who always is reliable for a good presentation, anything that's educational. And I know that what I know about Colin is that he is the originator of the Kelsey line of dahlias, and specializes in mostly open center varieties is what he's become famous for. And not only has he now won the Connell Medal, but is a multiple winner of the Gullickson Award for the best introduction of a open-centered variety. So, Colin, you are on.
So thank you for having me here to talk today about novelties. As Larry mentioned, I specialize in hybridizing open-centered varieties. My mantra is, and you'll hear this frequently from me, real dahlias have 8 petals. We're going to talk a little bit about novelties today and kind of the good and not so good elements of novelty as a form and a classification. So I'm going to start off with just putting our classification in front of you. So this is straight from the 2019 American Dahlia Society Classification Handbook of Dahlias. And I bolded some phrases that I think are key to novelty classification. So they have a distinct and different form or characteristics distinct and different from present classifications. And then also they need to display good symmetry, closed tight center, petals need to be uniformly shaped and arranged, but all of it in the context of this is distinct and different from existing classifications. So for example, a bad formal deck, just because it's pretty, isn't a novelty because it exhibits primarily characteristics of formal decorative, so it's not distinct and different. A valley porcupine, however, has characteristics that are distinct and different. I mean, you can touch it and almost draw blood. That is distinct and different from most existing classifications. One thing that I'll call out here is that notice that color isn't mentioned here. So some growers have advocated for color to possibly drive a novelty classification as well as form. So for example, if a color came along that didn't meet the current definitions, would that make it a novelty? Think of Verone's obsidian, dark red, but could be considered black. Before we redefined I believe it's the purple color classification to include black, could that have been a novelty? Novelties are strictly based on form, and so I think that that's one of the important things to consider. So another example would possibly be a variegated bicolor. I would argue that and probably still classify it as a bicolor because the base coloring is still bicolor. It's just one of the colors is variegated and possibly the second color is variegated. So there's no mechanism in the form definition which drives the classification as a novelty for unique colors. So the color is what it is, and the form of the dahlia is what puts it into the form classification as a novelty. One thing that I did is I thought, okay, well, let's see what the Australians and the British have to say about novelties. And so this is off of the National Dahlia Society out of the UK. They categorize them as miscellaneous dahlias. So anything that doesn't fall into the standard form definitions. So thistle dahlias, they specifically call out thistle dahlias. And then also species dahlias, which is, I think is kind of interesting since species dahlias really are singles generally. But that's how they qualify miscellaneous dahlias. Those of you who hybridize, I'm sure your compost bin is full of things like those two fine examples on the left. Dahlia Society of Australia also calls them miscellaneous dahlias, and The other types of dahlias, which at present have no, and I'm highlighting the word at present, have no officially recognized standards for judging. So, really relying on the judges to figure it out. And that phrase "at present" is going to become important in a couple of minutes. So show of hands, how many of you have seen this absolutely delightful, beautiful, fabulous specimen of a seedling rescued from the compost bin? So Kelsey Bob, I'm not sure how this managed to survive from the first year to the second year. I can only think that it kind of had a center and kind of looked okay in the seedling patch as a first year seedling. So we thought, let's keep that and see what it looks like. So this grew, and as my dad and I were picking for a show, it was picking for the Kitsap County Dahlia Society show. This thing came into the garage, and I looked at it and thought, wow, I have to enter that. I have frequently made snarky comments about novelties in general in the show, because the novelty section tends to get a lot of stuff that's either misclassified or really should just be pitched as not an exhibition flower. So I thought, I'm going to take this fine flower and enter it in the novelty section, and let's see what happens. I mean, it doesn't fit. It's distinct and different from every other defined form out there. So it's an open-centered novelty. So got it classified at the show, entered it, and it won best in show, best novelty open center in show. So I thought, okay, well, this thing needs a name. So I won't go into the naming process. I'll let you speculate on how it ended up being named, looking for someone to name a unique flower after. And I kept on entering it, and it kept on winning, because really, and I really kept on entering it because to make a statement that what is a novelty? What is an open-centered novelty? And as hard as some judges tried, I think Ted Kennedy probably holds the record for giving it the most uncontested red ribbons in show, which I applaud him for. As much as people tried, they couldn't say, well, no, it's an ugly flower. I readily admit it's an ugly flower, but it's a novelty. So it created a conversation, a much needed conversation. And I will say that this picture, it's kind of like when we rescued this from as a first year seedling. I'm not quite sure how I got such a good picture of such an ugly flower, but that's its public face. So this all highlights the fact that just because it doesn't match a current definition doesn't mean that it's novel. You can have a bad dahlia like Kelsey Bob that is bad form and bad color and just bad. That doesn't make it a novelty. But the way that our classification book is structured right now, it is a novelty. So I'll keep entering it and see what happens. I want to highlight, so think back to the Dahlia Society. I think it was the Australia Dahlia Society definition, where it was classifications that were not currently represented in the classification book, forms that were not currently defined in the classification book. I want to highlight stellars and orchettes. So stellars have been around for a long time, but up until fairly recently, and those of you who have been around a while, I was trying to remember when we added stellars as a distinct form. I want to say that it's been about 20 years. Mark, Ted, do either of you remember? Brad, is it kind of that era, about 20 years
That's
ish,
about right. Yeah.
about right. Yeah. So uh, they were initially classified as novelties since there was really no place to put them. Jesscott Julie, which is the picture on the far left, that was actually one of the first varieties that I ever grew. And since then, you see that the form has become much more refined. We've had new introductions that have been bred more closely to male characteristics. And in a way, this is really no different than water lilies. Old water lilies were really rough, and they've evolved as hybridizers have kept things that more closely match the form definitions. Even the worst water lilies of today would have a hard time winning a red ribbon against or the worst water lilies of today would certainly beat the best water lilies of 100 years ago. And even then, it's a much newer form. So stellars were entered as novelties. And then people started thinking, wow, we really should create a form definition specifically for stellars. So it went through the process to create the form definition, and we broke stellars out of water lily or out of novelties and created their own section in the classification book and sections in shows. Another example is orchettes. So every year, Harold Miller, who was a longtime dahlia grower and a charter member of Puget Sound Dahlia Association, he died in 2007. He created a booth at the entrance of the PSDA show, which highlighted the many forms of the dahlia. He did have a unique interest in open-centered dahlias, as well as others that attracted the attention of the general public. So one of his more well-known introductions is Santa Claus. So that's kind of the style of dahlia he introduced. And as far back as I remember, he was promoting the concept of adding orchettes as a recognized dahlia form. We already had some orchettes in the classification book. So Christmas Star on the left was released by Les Connell in 1986. Mars was released by Pauline Fanning in 1985. It was classed as a collarette, but it's an orchette at heart. And Alpen Imp was released by Bill McLaren in 2002. These all predated Verone's Morning Star, which took the novelty section by storm as it worked its way through the ADS bench and trial garden process toward its 2011 release. And I couldn't quite remember, but I believe it may have won the Stanley Johnson Award as a novelty. And if not as a novelty, it was shortly after the orchette classification, orchette form was broken out. Since then, as we've seen with stellars, the form has become more refined with varieties like Fancy Pants in the middle rising above the competition. So you can see that the novelty form gave us a path to get really great flowers hybridized and introduced. It gave them a place to be shown. Nobody can argue that Fancy Pants is not an exhibition quality dahlia. It is. And the only reason why it's being shown and why hybridization programs were built toward developing Fancy Pants is because there was a place to show it in the show. Few people are going to hybridize something specifically for the novelty section. I don't. I pitch most of them. They're compost. Steve and Sandy Boley fed them to the neighbor cows. That's where they go. So
my wife Margaret likes them still.
She likes them. So, are all novelties bad? Should we even have the classification? Are these all destined for compost? And in short, no, because there are some opportunities to see some new forms, see them fully refined. We need a place to put those. We need some place to put things that are truly novel and worthy of exhibition. That being said, just because it's interesting or eye-catching or seems like something that should be kept doesn't mean that it's exhibition quality. So like Kelsey Bob, that could be a crowd pleaser in the garden, which it's not, but it could be a crowd pleaser in the garden, and it could be something that we keep because it has creates some general interest. Steve Nowotarski, prior to his death, was promoting a garden dahlia evaluation program, and he, like many of us, saw that general gardeners were interested in those unique varieties that added color to the garden. In our hybridization program, the vast majority of what we keep is with an eye toward exhibition. So we breed to the perfect form. That means we're going to be tossing a bunch of stuff that's okay, but doesn't quite hit the mark, especially in our more refined single, collarette, mignon single, and mignon collarette programs. This is partly because a bad dahlia will never get better, but also because we don't have a whole lot of space to keep stuff around. So with a collarette, if it can't beat Kelsey Sunshine or Kelsey Annie Joy, I don't want it because I already have 2 nice collarettes, and I want something that's going to be equal to or better than those. Same thing with mignon singles. If it can't compete against Kelsey Dwarf, it's just wasting room in the garden. So we're looking for how can we further refine and advance the form. That being said, we do keep some stuff around for their unique attributes. So our club maintains a display garden at the Bellevue Botanical Garden. And by our club, it's pretty much my dad who maintains it. My dad spends a lot of time up there, and the general public, they're not stopping to take selfies with Embrace or Barbary Red Dwarf. They're stopping to take selfies with open-centered varieties, things that would not stand a chance on the show bench. They want unique stuff. They want colorful stuff. They want the weird stuff. And because of this, it's not uncommon for us to actually keep stuff out of the seedling patch that we know will never be kept for exhibition, but we know that, hey, it could be a crowd pleaser at Bellevue Botanical Garden. And I think what we need to get away from is assuming that every dahlia that comes out of a hybridization program should have a place in the general horticultural section of the Dahlia Show. Not to pick on Ted, but Ted has often said that he hybridizes for arrangements, and some of his introductions are produced with the sole purpose of ensuring that Margaret has something even newer and even more interesting to put into her arrangement so that she can continue to be Gordon Jackman. It's looking for things that have that visual interest, and you have to have the use case in mind for the flower. So maybe it's in a garden, maybe it's in a vase, but you have to have that use case in mind. So Novelty fully double classification is in much better shape these days than the open-centered novelties. I see these falling into into 3 different categories. Well, I guess 4. So Valley Porcupine gets its own category. There's nothing else like it yet, and it's really an outlier in terms of form, but it's a true novelty. It doesn't fit anywhere else, and it stands on its own. We're also seeing some development of fully double orchids. So think of Vista Mini, or up in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, that's a 3rd-year seedling out of our seed bed that's a fully double orchid. Think of your standard orchid petal only on a fully double dahlia. No other place to put them comes nowhere close to any other form definition. You also have the thistle-esque dahlias. So for those of you who've been around for a while, you remember thistle probably when it actually still had a center. It's pretty much gone entirely open center at this point, but these are dahlias like horse feathers and kung fu kitty and shanxi. They're showing up much more frequently, and they're not laciniated though. So even though they have a frilly look, they're not laciniated, so they have no other place to go. A quick search of the ADS online classification book that Brad mentioned earlier will let you filter to whatever form you're interested in. And you can look through pictures of stuff that's out there and see that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with cleaning this up. So, you know, bad incurve cactuses or formal decoratives or water lilies or stellars are not novel. They're just bad examples of the current form. So keep in mind it has to be distinct and different from present form. As an example, these are currently classified as fully double novelties. So you see some cactuses, some incurved cactuses, some stellars, some they don't know what they want it to be. And does it need to be in the book? And are these, just because it can't win as its classification, does it need to have a place in a show? Probably not. As I mentioned, the vast majority of novelties which are classified as open-centered novelties fall into two different categories. It's either stuff that's misclassified or stuff that's just not exhibition quality, or for some super special ones, it could be both. They could fall in both categories. So what I've seen over the years is that as one form gets refined, so collarettes and orchettes have been much more fully defined and refined. Old favorites tend to move to become novelties because they don't fit the new standards. A good example of this is Mars. So Mars for years was a collarette before we knew that collarettes needed to have flat petals with round tips. Now that we have an orchette form, Mars more closely fits the orchette form, but it doesn't fully, the petals don't fully involute enough to be consistently orchette. So it gets stuck as a novelty. You know, if it doesn't fit here and it doesn't fit here, it must be a novelty. We need to get away from that. As Dick Parshall wrote about in Dahlias of Today several years ago about the form continuum. Dahlias fall on a form continuum. So just because they don't meet the ideal form doesn't mean that they aren't that form. They're just a little bit separated from that form. I've included a handful of pictures of varieties that are currently classified as novelties as of last night in the ADS online classification book. So, you know, we have a halfway decent orchette. So next one is a mignon orchid or orchette. Looks like it has some tiny petaloids, so it's a form break either in orchette or orchid. Third one is a really bad collarette that I guess is novel because the collars are messy and it has, what, 10 petals. Another one is, I categorize that as a just another dahlia seedling. So you plant a seed and it pops up and someone thought to save that and plop a name onto it. There's an orchid with a whole bunch of petals that claw in different ways. I think it has 12 petals. So it doesn't meet the definition of having 8 petals, but that doesn't mean that it's not still an orchid. And then the last one is an anemone. So I know that there's been some controversy about anemones with petaloids in the past, but what I will do is I'll point you toward the ADS form definition, which states that anemones have a dome of the tubes in the center, so a nice dome of tubes, surrounded by one or more rows of petals. It doesn't say how the petals, the ray florets, should be formed. So having a collar attached or having an orchid form petal or really any formation of petal around that dome is fine. It's supposed to frame it nicely, and I think that that's the key. But just because it has a different petal form around the dome from what we're used to doesn't make it novel. It's still an anemone. It's still on that form continuum. And it's up to the judges to decide, hey, is this a good example or is this a bad example? In this case, I think it's interesting. And I think it's a conversation starter. And, you know, I know this is going to be kind of harsh, but going back to the example of Kelsey Bob, what makes a Dahlia novel? If these are novel, then so is Kelsey Bob, and whatever the next Bob-esque flower is that was caused by a bee that had previously landed on, I don't know, a pot plant, a puddle of booze. What causes a bee to breed Kelsey Bob? That's going to be the next thing that shows up in the novelty category. So part of this is refining it. So this brings us to the what's next question. What do we do with this information? So in shows, what we need to remember is that we're judging based on the classification book criteria. So first and foremost, if you are judging in a show in the novelty section, novelties need to be distinct and different from present classifications. If you have a Mars entered as an open-centered novelty as example, it would lose a bunch of points on form since it's not novel. It's either a bad colorette or a bad orchette. We judge dahlias as classified, but we also need to judge them to the classification. So an argument that I hear all the time is, well, it's classified as a novelty, so we need to judge it there, which is true. We judge them as classified in the show. But just like a formal deck or a semi-cactus or a laciniate, if it doesn't match the form definition, it's going to lose a whole lot of points on form. And what's most important in the judging criteria? Form. So keep that in mind. I also really feel like we need to look at combining, and this could either be in the classification book or probably more likely just in the shows, the novelty classifications into one section. So I've won an embarrassing amount of money off of Kelsey Bob, but when it's really the only thing that can fit somewhere else aside from the compost, it's going to continue to win. Combining our open center and fully double novelty sections together, it would help solve that. So I'm an open-centered hybridizer, as I mentioned. Real dahlias have 8 petals. So it really pains me to say this, but the fully double novelty varieties are so much better than anything at all in the open-centered novelty space. And they actually belong in the head table, unlike Kelsey Bob. So this leaves space for, combining these together would leave space for new and interesting varieties to be exhibited. So think back to when orchettes were classified as novelties. They would still have a place to compete. Fully double orchids, thistle form, whatever the case may be. So provide that space for them to compete, but also would help make our head tables look a little bit better and keep ugly stuff like Kelsey Bob off of it. Let's focus on rewarding quality. And until then, I'll keep entering Kelsey Bob until it stops winning. Because, $20 for a head table prize for an ugly flower, I'll keep exploiting that as long as the thing is there to exploit. A lot of this also requires some classification book cleanup. So there was a variety that I had resubmitted. I forget which variety it was, but I said, it's either an orchid or it's an orchette. It exhibits characteristics of both at various times in the show season, which tells you something about the variety. If it is an orchid part of the time and an orchette part of the time, probably not exhibition worthy. And I sent it to the classification committee to review. They reviewed it, it went through the process, and there wasn't clear consensus on whether it was an orchette or an orchid, so it stayed a novelty. And amusingly, the majority of the classification committee members voting agreed that it was something other than a novelty, but because they couldn't agree on whether it was an orchid or an orchette, it stayed as a novelty. So they said, yeah, this is not a novelty, but we can't figure out what it is, so we're going to leave it there. This is something that probably needs to be fixed, particularly as we look at novelties. I'd also like to see you focus on garden dahlias. So this picture on the right, this is a variety called Annie's Sunflower. Annie picked this out of our seedling patch when she was 3 years old. She's 12 going on 20 right now. You know, this is what the general public loves. They're not going to, when was the last time you saw a cafe au lait do anything in a Dahlia show? I don't know that I've ever even seen a cafe au lait exhibited in a Dahlia show, but the general public loves it for some reason. So focusing on garden dahlias gives a place for some of these new and interesting varieties to be put. Gives it benefits our clubs by increasing tuber sales and increasing interest in dahlias, and it also separates exhibition, which we typically hybridize for, from just a pretty garden dahlia. Annie's Sunflower is, it'll be released exclusively through Puget Sound Dahlia Association's tuber sale next year, and I fully expect it to sell out. I mean, with that picture, it's eye-catching, it's pretty, it'd look good in a garden. So I have these three ideas. It's also highly likely that someone has a brilliant idea that I haven't thought of, and that being said, what I do know is that we need to continue to have some type of novelty classification in the future, but it needs to be tweaked from where it's at. So I'll leave you with a lovely picture of Kelsey Bob. This is Kelsey Bob as a second-year seedling taken toward the end of the first show season where I exhibit it. Season that it took the Federation by storm. I'll let you define whether that was by storm in a good way or bad way. And I do continue to blame my dad for marking this in the seed bed. I fully believe it's his fault that we currently have Kelsey Bob gracing our show tables. But it's also a good discussion point. What is a novelty? So with that, I don't know if we have any time for questions, but happy to answer any that you might have.
I did want to mention that Kelsey Aria was the one, this 2020 Evie Gullickson Medal winner, which is awarded to the cultivar that has the highest average seedling bench evaluation score and the cultivar with the highest average trial garden score as an open center or disc center. And so this last year we did have trial gardens and it did really well. And it looks like, I would say dark pink.
A light blend.
Okay, light blend.
Yeah. And so funny story behind that. Those of you who have been around me a bit, especially in a show, know that I tend to make snarky comments about different varieties that I don't necessarily think match current form definition, which is completely against. I never do it when I'm judging, really, because judges' demeanor and all, you need to make sure that you exhibit appropriate demeanor. But afterwards, yeah. Alpen Diamond, so really pretty flower. I mean, it's another example of a variety that is on that form continuum. It's a beautiful flower, but it's a crummy collarette. If you read the collarette form definition, it has a petal and it has a petaloid, but it's not a good, it doesn't have good form. It keeps winning though because it's pretty and largely because of the color. When I saw Kelsey Aria in the in our second year bed, it's like, oh, that's our Alpen Diamond killer right there. So it's a collarette light blend that has better form than Alpen Diamond. So that's the story behind that. Named after my second daughter.
Colin, my question for you is, should we take what you've said today as gospel, as ADS endorsed, or is what you said today your opinion?
A lot of it is, so I'll preface this as I am not in any leadership capacity at all within the American Dahlia Society or the Federation of Northwest Dahlia Growers. I am an ADS senior judge, have been for probably close to 20 years. I'm one of the instructors of our judging classes in the Federation. So I typically take it from the angle of, let's look at the definition and look at what the definition says. So this is generally my opinion, but it's founded in my interpretation of the classifications as published, and this tracks with what we teach in our judging classes. So as we're teaching judges right now, my dad and I teach the candidate judging class, but we also taught the senior judging class for years. This tracks very closely with what we teach in the judging program and with what is included in the judging curriculum. So generally my opinion, but at the same time, it's following closely with what the ADS puts out.
Any other questions for Mr. Walker? Okay.
Dan, you had one?
Yeah, Mark?
I think Jan put in the text that she was wondering about questions, so just making sure.
Oh.
Jan had a chance to ask if she had one.
Yeah, he wanted to make sure that what garden you mentioned that I think Roger mostly takes care of. And
oh yeah, so that's a Bellevue Botanical Garden. It's in Bellevue, Washington, which is where I grew up. It's where I work, right across the lake from Seattle, right across Lake Washington from Seattle. And it's a world-renowned botanical garden, and within that for years and years, I think probably almost since the beginning of the garden, so 25 plus years, Puget Sound Dahlia Association has maintained a dahlia display garden in that park. So most of it is filled with named varieties, released varieties, but then we also do have a number of our second, third, fifth, 12th year seedlings out there just to add some color. PSDA also maintains another display garden at Volunteer Park in Seattle. And we, tubers for that come from a variety of sources, but we do also include some of ours, some of typically the named varieties. So either something that is close to being released or has been released, we ship stuff over to that as well.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you please, Colin, go back to one of your slides? It was one of the last ones of the novelties. You had 4 pictures, and it was the third one I had a question. I think you said, I guess the question was, is this a bad form of something else, or is this a novelty? And your third one, I think you said, this is just what we call a seedling. Did I understand that correctly?
Oh yeah, so let me—
Can you go back to that slide? Because
yeah.
I have one similar, and I'm wondering what you would call that.
So is it this
yes,
one?
It's the 4th, I believe it is the 4th one.
That one right there?
Or,
yeah.
Or it might have been a different slide that had only 4, I thought.
Yeah, the one with only 4 had it had the good had some good examples. So this one, I definitely call this a just another dahlia seedling flower. So if you, oops, what did I do? There we go. So if you ask any hybridizer what 90% of what they toss in a given year looks like, it's generally going to look something like that. It'll have 1 or 2 rows of petals, a wide open center. Sometimes they're pretty, sometimes they have unique color, but as an exhibition dahlia, it doesn't meet any of the current exhibition criteria. That being said, that out in the botanical garden border, you'd have a line of people wanting to take a selfie with that flower. So
my one, here's a question. If that 4th flower had 2 rows of petals and they were uniform color without those curly little things, would one be able to enter that as a novelty and as an exhibition or not?
Probably not. Yeah, I would argue that it wouldn't necessarily be exhibition worthy as a novelty. I mean, on the form continuum, it would probably be closest to a peony. really it's just a big peony that doesn't quite match the peony definition. So that's where that form continuum, just because it's not the perfect form doesn't mean that it isn't that form.
Right, that's, okay.
It's sort of in the category of a Swan Island one called Junkyard Dog. That
I
has
think
been
that might actually
hugely
be Junkyard Dog.
successful.
Yeah, I think that might actually be Junkyard Dog.
Yeah, looks like it.
Junkyard Dog.
Yeah.
I
And
remember a
you're,
few years ago in the Canby Trail Garden, there was one that was actually entered in the trail garden that was in a catalog for the next year and was going to be sold, but something happened in the trail garden. They all opened their center and they had weird little squiggly. Everybody, whenever I was out there working, would ask me, where can I get that? Wanted that dahlia, and that's not the way it was supposed to be, but they loved it. Barbara,
I think Swan Island made a lot of money off of Junkyard Dog, from what I remember. They could not have enough when
because
it
of the
came out.
name too.
Yeah,
the name.
We named it Junkyard Dog because it was something they thought nobody would like, and everybody loved it anyhow. So they decided to keep it rather than put it in a junkyard. And I remember the one in the trial garden is nobody paid any attention to it until it opened in the center, and it had all these wild curly petals in the middle, and everyone loved it.
It was just mentioned, since we're talking about the head tables and what we do as educating the public and whatnot on what a true form, what we're trying to accomplish as hybridizers and as a society. And you try to bring these things up and you judge them up, and now we have 5 different novelties stuck together, and there's no true guidelines, and everybody's trying to use it by, well, what is the best of form? Well, it's by definition, it means it's really, there's nothing. So I find it a challenge when I do see some things, and there's some great ones, and I'm not to throw out a name, but all of a sudden they make it to the head table to beat out, let's say, a formal deck in that particular thing. And I find that kind of odd, because by definition, it shouldn't really go beyond a novelty place on the head table. And that's what my thoughts. I don't know what the opinion is going on with the ADS is about that, but I don't know if you want to comment toward that.
Mistakes are going to be made in judging. And the wrong flower is going to be picked in several occasions. It happens at national shows, it happens at local shows. I mean, I can think of some very specific examples at the 2014 National Show in Tacoma, where we were really close to having a section rejudged because the wrong thing was picked. Example at Puget Sound Dahlia Association show several years ago, a group that was judging, I think they were judging the ball or mini ball section, sent up a fabulous miniature formal deck or formal deck instead of something with ball or mini ball form. And it was very obviously the wrong form. It was a pretty flower, may have had less damage than others, but it was just, you know, they picked the wrong thing. So that's going to happen all the time. I think what I always look for is when situations happen like that, how can we use it as a teachable moment? How can we use it to improve our judges training down the road? So if we're consistently seeing things picked that should not go up to the head table, you know, who is on that team? What type of conversation needs to be had after the fact with, you know, did you look at this and what were you seeing with this flower? Why did you pick this formal deck instead of, which very clearly had shingles on the roof, instead of a mini ball, which should have rounded petals? And also, you know, with head table judging, there are people, I go and assemble the head table teams. We typically have 4 teams, 2 for open center and 2 for fully double at the PSDA and Seattle Dahlia Society show. And there are people who I will not ask to judge certain things because they have exhibited a consistent lack of understanding of how things should be judged. So a lot of it is just assembling judging teams.
Yeah.
My dad deals with that when he assembles judging teams for the show. It's like, if we have someone who we know struggles with something, who can we put with them? So it could be, Brad Freeman, who is a fantastic judge, might be paired with someone who needs some extra instruction, because we know that as a solid judge, he can steer things in the right direction and ultimately pick the right dahlia. And I think, particularly with our judging chairs, whoever is assembling the judging teams needs to have a solid enough understanding of people's strengths and weaknesses as judges, which is only built up over years and years, to be able to assemble the teams to ultimately pick the right flower.
Right. Yeah. And I kind of actually make that comment at all our shows. It says, don't worry, there'll be 20 people who will always say that the judge picked the wrong bloom. So that's not a problem.
Yeah.
But I think more in line with the one when I was talking about the seedling bench, when it was judged and they had the thing, does it fit form, and the interpretation is, and it didn't have any horse in this race. I mean, it's not a thing. It's just a notice. And yet the novelty came, well, it meets the novelty form. So it scored high with that part, which actually beat out something that was actually true to a true form. So maybe that's something that can be, addressed in the scorecards. Because I would hate to see a trial garden or an SBE and say, well, yeah, it says novelties, they'll score at high points, and it bumps out something that somebody's worked really hard to get the true genetics that we're looking for in there.
So Bob, can I address this for a minute? When
Sure.
I'm looking at novelties, I look at it in some respects the same way that I would anything that was classified in one of the regular forms. Is I'm looking for regularity and predictability and symmetry and evenness in color and development. And if I, see that I have a novelty that meets all those characteristics, and it's doing a better job of being in the regular form and the regular color and the regular development of the florets, that it might well beat out something that is more clearly matching a particular form definition. So that's also part of my definition of what makes a good novelty versus a bad something else.
So in that case, I could see it. We'll take the one that showed in the Bill Mishler one as a novelty.
Oh yeah.
But yet it's compared. Yeah, it's got great form. It's got great shape. But then it should be a formal deck. So see, so it's not really a thing. So it's that we're taking a look that we're wrong. And then I get your point to do that. I mean, it's like we can look at some of these things and we're saying, well, now we're trying to give regular quality stuff to a novelty when it's really by standard not something that's really there.
Most of these things that were classified as novelties weren't done on the seedling bench, and they weren't done at trial gardens.
Right.
They were classification teams at shows that put that thing on there, and then it got a blue ribbon, and then it ended up in the book when it got 2 blue ribbons. And so that's how Bill Mishler got to be a novelty, because it was sent back east to where the judging may not be as thorough as it is here, and it got put into novelty. And Bill Mishler would have laughed when he heard that, but he appreciated it.
Well,
but then, like I said, it gets
classification changes.
Yeah, but then that's what I said. Then and it was just try to get something I would think what we're looking more closely to. It's like, yeah, it's a novelty, but it's showing it's showing a majority of forms of a formal deck and one form of a novelty. Now, like Holly Hill Spider Woman, that's got all kinds of crazy stuff going on. But yet you can find some symmetry and you can find some attractiveness into that. And you can't, it's really tough to even call it a cactus at anything to do it. So that's the thing. Some that are they're in the ballpark and they say, oh, that's beautiful, let's move it up to do that, when it's one of those valley type blooms to do that. But I do get that where it said, yeah, no, it's not in the trial gardens doing that. So it was just an observation, and what makes, to be honest, what makes it challenging for me to judge the novelties. Because I pulled the stuff that Linda just brought in my head the first time, thinking like, okay, what's the symmetry? What's this? But
everything but the definition. There's no definition of the flower, but we got to go by does it have the same number of petals on this side as that side?
When you start to add in, distinctiveness points, how distinct is it from everything else that is regular classified forms? And that would be, as Colin said, I think a reason to knock it down for form is that it's not distinct enough. The
Right.
Bill Mishler, it's not distinct enough to really stand out and say, like River's Purple Pinwheel is pretty distinctive looking.
Mm-hmm.
And that hit novelty at first, and sometimes has gone into stellar. Valley Porcupine, that's distinctive. But Holly Hill Bill Mishler is a great flower, but I definitely would put it in formal deck. So maybe it's time for us to hit up the classification committee.
Maybe it is time for things that land in novelty. Maybe it does. Maybe a novelty requires a greater level of review, similar to not necessarily a seedling bench evaluation process, but more of a formal review than stick it in 2 shows and get blue ribbons for it to land in novelty. But that's for the classification committee to discuss.
Colin has not a free moment. He's so busy. And so extra thanks for coming and sharing your knowledge and information with us.
I would like to thank all of you for having me here today. It has been an absolute pleasure.